Hello, I'm Anna Dellinger, and this is my presentation on a population segment profile and church planting strategy for second-generation Mexican immigrants. So as you can see, there are sort of two worlds. Some of the research limitations during this project were the specificity of my qualifiers, second generation Mexican in Oklahoma. There isn't necessarily as much research done on second generation immigrants as there are on first generation immigrants. And Hispanic is actually, or Latino, are more broadly used terms that Mexicans are encompassed within. And so Hispanic and Latino studies occur more frequently, but that includes Peruvians and Puerto Ricans and Colombians. And so it was hard to find specific data on second generation Mexicans in Oklahoma. There are also questions of race, ethnicity, and identity. For example, when Hispanics are filling out census forms, they don't know if they should mark white, if they should mark Latino. If there's an option to mark Mexican, they would do that. But some of them are American born. So then that's sort of the question of what is their race? What is their identity? How are they supposed to indicate that to others? Some of the studies that I found have fairly old data, as old as 10 to 15 years ago, which is actually especially important in this case as the population of second generation Mexican immigrants is just exploding right now across the United States. Another reason that some of this is difficult information to procure is because sometimes Hispanics, specifically Mexican Americans, will not answer things like government censuses and other surveys, reports, things like that because of the fear of deportation, not usually of themselves, because many of them are American born, but of their families. And then COVID-19 prevented some of the opportunities I would have had to carry out some more interviews or visit other events going on like rodeos, quinceañeras, Catholic church services, and things like that. So first off, who are the people? This is the demographic information, and the most important thing starting out is to define second generation. So these people are, as you can see in the picture, American grown with Mexican roots. They're caught between two worlds. Most of them speak two languages. They speak one language at home, Spanish, and they speak English everywhere else. And so it creates this division within their life between home life and the rest of society, school, church, their friends, social media. They live sort of a dual life. And a lot of them are also mixed race. Some of them may be Mexican and Cuban, or some of them may be Mexican and have one American-born parent. Some of them may be just Black and Mexican. So this mixed race can also lead to them being caught between two worlds, even amongst the rest of the general population. And they're also not immigrants for the most part, but treated as one because they're the children of immigrants that have come over from Mexico and that are born and then they are born in the United States. However, I also included one of my interviewees and some of my information included within this project. I talk about the 1.5 generation, which, if you're familiar with American politics, are often referred to as dreamers. And they benefited from the DACA Act. And so these are children that were born in Mexico but brought to the United States at 12 years of age or younger. And so they also are American grown with Mexican roots, but they don't have that layer of citizenship to protect them from deportation. So where do Hispanics or Mexican Americans live in the state of Oklahoma? You can see a very large population of them in Oklahoma City, and then next in Tulsa, as it sort of goes down. They're actually very growing populations in places like Stillwater, Hennessy, Enid, and other more rural towns in Oklahoma. As of 2010, Hispanics made up 11% of the state population, but as of the 2020 census, when it comes out, it's likely that it will make up a significantly higher percentage. Um, Even 1% is a big increase, but my guess would be that it would be more than that. And so this is obviously a large part of the population of our state, and it's important to know about them to be able to reach them. In fact, one of the reasons why I was doing this project is and chose this population segment is because I grew up on the south side of Oklahoma City, attending an inner city school where I was one of 3 white kids in my graduating class of 150. And so I grew up with many Mexican Americans, and I have taken on part of their culture as my own. I eat the food. I know some of the songs. I dance bachata at the quinceañeras. I'm invited to the events. My dad would probably say I run on Mexican time, and I have a deep love of soccer that is not quite as American as other people's love of football. And so that's one of the reasons why I chose this population segment for this project. Next, and perhaps most important to focus on for Mexican American families, is the family structure, because family always comes first. You'll see this over and over again with any interaction that you have with a Mexican family, that the family comes first, no matter what. It often comes before. Americans are sometimes known for prioritizing God and then family and then work, et cetera, et cetera. But really, a lot of times, even within Mexican American families, family trumps religion, trumps everything else, for families that aren't professing believers. And so the man is often the head of the house. In single mother households, if there's a son, he's given a lot of responsibility and ends up taking a lot of lead in the house at a young age. Sometimes before they're a teenager, they're taking on some responsibilities as the man of the house. They demonstrate this family first idea by constantly, like every weekend, eating together, celebrating things like weddings, baby showers, quinceañeras, which is the 15th birthday party for young women. And a lot of them live together because kinship extends to all blood relatives. So you may have 3 or 4 generations even living in one home, where you have a great grandma and a mom and then the children. And then you have aunts and uncles that are more transient, sometimes coming over from Mexico, needing a place to stay until they can establish themselves in their own homes. And then you also have the idea of the compadrasco, which is a system of godparents, which is used by both religious families and non-religious families. And these godparents fill in for the parents if they, for example, can't meet a financial need, or if their children, if they happen to pass away, they would essentially become the guardians of the children and adopt them as their own. Honor y vergüenza, honor and shame. That is the primary model of understanding in Mexican American culture. There is a secondary model of guilt and innocence due to the assimilation within American culture. But honor and shame is really what the focus is. A big part of that is machismo. So it's the masculinity or manliness within the culture. It's what makes a man. Sometimes it's associated with pride. You can imagine having your chest puffed out and walking with a swagger, and that's another good visual image of machismo. It leads to a division of household tasks. For example, only women are allowed to cook and clean and dress the children. That is not a job for men. And it's also connected to the sexual purity in women. So, for example, if a young woman gets pregnant outside of wedlock as a teenager, it brings great shame to the family. And sometimes they're even kicked out of their families. A lot of times they can never restore that honor that they've lost there for themselves or for their family. But what's interesting is the second generation, the Mexican Americans, they see their parents, they see their uncles, their grandfathers, and they don't like this machismo. They don't want to be a part of it. As you can see, Rivera was talking about the cultures that men are more dominant, and that's not something he likes about his culture. That's something he's wanting to change. Another part of honor and shame is forgiveness, or in this case, the lack thereof. Mexican families aren't good at practicing forgiveness, and it's because they don't really resolve conflict. They get in a shouting match, they yell at each other for a while, go their separate ways, and then sort of let the passage of time heal wounds, except that usually it's just sort of a cover up and things aren't necessarily going back to the way they were before. There's not a lot of resolution in that. And the idea that Casas shares that there is that because your family, I have to get along with you, even though I don't want to. So we'll sort of put our differences aside, not solve them, we'll put them aside and try to keep being family again. And part of that is just because it can be shameful. It can bring a lot. It can cause you to lose honor or lose face when you ask for forgiveness or when you admit to have done something wrong. And you can see in the second generation, as I've touched on a little bit about the machismo, there's a desire for change in this second generation. Part of it is because they have things that their parents never had. As American citizens, they have the right to vote. They have a lot more access to higher education, going to colleges and universities. And there's much more assimilation into American culture. So, for example, Juarez says, there's no point in passing on culture from a place I didn't grow up from. There's a lot of views that my parents have that I don't agree with. And so he talked about wanting to change and be that change for when he has children someday. And Casas and her family have taken on themselves to teach their little brother in her parents' absences, just because they're working all the time, that they essentially, he can have a more American ideal, at least from their perspective, than a Mexican one, sort of teaching him that machismo is not the way to live, that he should have more respect for women and all people. So next we move on to the social structure within the ethnographic and worldview. And again, focusing on the honor and shame, what brings honor, what avoids causing shame. One of those big things is graduating high school and then going to college. Casas shared how her dad was so proud of her that he cried when she graduated high school. And if I remember correctly, she said he had never done that before, or she had never seen him cry. And he was just so proud of her. Family almost always supports the decisions their members make. Even if they disagree with it at first, it goes back to that family first mentality of, okay, my family's doing this, I'm going to be 100% behind it, whether that's entrepreneurial work, maybe someone starts their own business. Even if the family isn't necessarily fully aligned with the business, eventually they'll come around to fully supporting that business. Again, mention of pregnancy outside of wedlock. It can also lead to rushed marriages to restore honor, but it's sort of a false sense of honor. And a lot of times these families may not end up staying together, or they stay together for years, but with poor relationships, because it was not really their decision to make, the couple. It was more forced upon them by their families. Social class can also bring shame. Interestingly enough, there's a Mexican phrase, ser pobrito es un delito. To be poor is a crime. And a lot of times people that are more impoverished are looked down upon by others within their own society. And this is not any different within American society. A Mexican-American society. And as an honor and shame culture, they're also a lot more family-oriented, group-oriented. And so a person is not guided as much by their conscience as what they're guilty about or right or wrong about, but about what their family will think about them and what the rest of society will think about them. Juarez shared about a time in his life where he didn't really have a chance of restoring honor. He and his girlfriend became pregnant outside of wedlock as teenagers. And she had a miscarriage, and he said, I feel sort of like I had a get out of jail free card, but if he had a child, he would have cared for the child. But he didn't really have a way of restoring that honor for himself and for his girlfriend. Some of the views on race. Older generations are less accepting of other races. Approximately 40% of American-born Hispanics have married a non-Hispanic, though. So that's sort of a changing view within the second generation. But 81% of Hispanics say they face discrimination and that it limits their chances to get ahead. It prevents them from going to college or getting scholarship, prevents them from getting jobs or promotions, prevents them sometimes from buying houses and things like that. And then Casas shares, as a 1.5 generation Mexican immigrant, she's undocumented. And so she says, even within my own people, I have men and women tell me, oh, you're not like us because you didn't come here legally, even though it wasn't her fault. She was 6 when she came to the United States. There are also rites of passage within Mexican American culture, and actually a lot of them are the typical American rites of passage: getting a driver's license, first job, getting married, having children. There are also some religious rites tied into the Catholic Church, such as baptism, I believe aligned with the first birthday, the first communion, and confirmation, which are classes that are essentially establishing a biblical foundation within the Catholic Church. And then quinceañeras, which is the 15th birthday of a young woman that sort of introduces her into womanhood. And in Mexico, it really signified that it was time that she was now available to become married. In the United States, it's more like a sweet 16, except almost treated as extravagantly as a wedding, where live music is hired, lots of catering, inviting many, many guests, an extravagant dress and a limo ride, choreographed dances. It's just a huge event for these young women's lives. Education is something that is highly valued within Mexican American society. It's very honorable to graduate high school and to go on to college. And actually, it starts at a young age. Kids, as soon as they can start reading, especially if their parents don't speak English, they're translating documents, they're helping pay bills and send mail for their parents, because often their parents can't read or write in English. Of course, they can read and write in Spanish, but the business that they're trying to conduct while they're here in Oklahoma in the United States, they aren't able to conduct in Spanish, so they call upon their children to help them. And then parents want something better for their children all the time. This is a lot of Mexican immigrant parents push their kids so hard in school because they want their children to achieve something better than they have ever had the opportunity to achieve themselves. And most of the time they are prevented from those things because of poverty and immigration. Now moving on to the religious, economic, and political structures of Mexican American culture. So the religious majorities are Catholic, Protestant, and unaffiliated. Actually, 3 of the 5 interviews that I held at the beginning of this project essentially said, I don't have a religion that I fully align with. They take bits and pieces of things that they agree with out of the Catholic faith, out of the Protestant faith, just out of general American religiosity, and they go with it. A lot of them believe in God, but not necessarily in the infallibility, the inerrancy of Scripture. And actually, you'll see many of these young men and women will be part of the Catholic Church until they move out of their house, and then now they leave the Catholic Church, and they may not go to any church because it's now their choice. Many Hispanics, both Catholic and non-practicing Catholic, pray to the saints, and even a few of them also make offerings to the saints. The most popular saint to receive prayers is the one that you see pictured on the screen. This is the Virgin de Guadalupe. It's a picture of the Virgin Mary. And there are also many religious holidays celebrated, again, not just by religious families, but by a lot of the Mexican American culture. So you have Ash Wednesday, Lent, Holy Week leading up to Easter. Easter, of course, there's a Children's Day, All Saints Day, the Virgin Mary's birthday, Christmas, and the Three Kings Day. So even for families that aren't very religious, religion still provides ethical rules and morals by which everyone in the community abides, and it guides decision-making and interactions with others. An important holiday that isn't necessarily religious is again more family oriented. Now, some Mexican American families do not practice this, but others, especially ones with closer ties to Mexico, do. And it's Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead. So this is a night, one night a year, usually in the first week of November, where Mexican families create altars, essentially, like you see in this picture, with photos of their loved ones that have passed on, and with some of their favorite trinkets, things that remind them of those people, and some of their favorite foods. And they also eat their favorite foods during the ceremony to remember them by. The idea is that the spirits of the dead come and visit their families during that time. And that's just the one time a year. So they make these offerings, ofrendas, for their families, and the spirits come and accept them on that night. Within economics, unfortunately, Oklahoma is ranked as the 18th worst state for Hispanics to live in, which is not that great out of 50 states. And it's based off of factors such as income, home ownership, education, and incarceration. There's a significantly high incarceration rate for Hispanics within Oklahoma that really affects them economically, obviously, in other parts of their lives. Hispanics, though, are critical to the growth of the U.S. economy. In 2015, 55 million Latinos living and working in the United States were responsible for $2.13 trillion, or 11.8% of America's 18.04 trillion gross domestic product. This is a really huge deal. 11% of an economy is no laughing matter, and Hispanics are responsible for that. So a lot of times they have jobs varying from low skill to high skill. A lot of people, when they think of Mexican immigrants or Mexican Americans, they think, oh, they're all in construction, or they're all in food service, they're all working in hotels. And this is not necessarily the case for the second generation. It's actually a growing disparity between the two generations, as many of the second generation have more access to higher education, complete college degrees, both bachelor's and master's, and many become teachers and nurses and mechanics and other high-skilled jobs within society. They're not just taking labor jobs or low-skill jobs that might be more available to people with lesser income, lesser opportunities, and lesser educational achievement. Oklahoma has at least 13,692 Hispanic entrepreneurs, according to a 2015 survey, and they created hundreds of thousands of jobs for the state of Oklahoma. Politics. So as second generation born in the United States, there's an increasing involvement in each political election as these men and women age into the system where they can vote. So as they turn 18, more and more can vote. Between naturalization and aging up, 5.7 million Hispanics will become eligible to vote in the 2020 election. Overall, 56% of Hispanics describe themselves as Democrats or as independents who lean toward the Democratic Party. This is because of different issues ranging from views on immigration, but also to government assistance, national security measures against terrorism, and others. It's not solely focused on the topic of immigration. They also have many other issues that they vote on that are more aligned with the Democratic Party. There's also a general sentiment of distaste and dissatisfaction with politics and government from all of the interviewees that I talked to. There are views on corruption, that they see a lot of white leadership, a lot of white male leadership, and people seeking after money instead of after the good of especially the minorities in the country. Even Casas, who doesn't have the opportunity to vote as an undocumented citizen, says, I don't like either side. They're both ugly, and I feel so bad for people who vote because you guys don't have a good choice. And next we cover orality. So there actually isn't much information on literacy, even within the United States today. It was hard to find for Mexican Americans specifically, and then even for Americans in general, literacy rates are harder and harder to track these days. But one thing that is easy to talk about is media and entertainment. And as many Mexican Americans have assimilated into much of American culture, while they do have some ties to their Mexican roots, most of them, many of them, if not most of them, consider themselves American and follow a lot of the mainstream culture. As you can see on here, there's a lot of interest in anime, in other mainstream shows like Friends and The Office, in video games, in other animated cartoons, and surprisingly, or maybe not, considering the luchadores in the wrestlers in Mexico, there's an interest in the WWE. So these are some of the things that are engaging Mexican Americans as far as entertainment is concerned. There's also a huge emphasis on music within the culture. Popular genres of Mexican music include tejano, habanera, conjunto, san jarocho, bachata, rancheras, and mariachi. You have probably heard, when you think Mexican music, you've probably heard a lot of mariachi and tejano, possibly even some bachata, depending on who you're around, where you've grown up, and sort of what you have access to either on the radio or in your general life. Those are some of the more common genres of music and popular genres of music. One of the most popular Tejano musicians is Selena, or Selena, and she is a Mexican-American icon. She's born in Corpus Christi, Texas, and died at the very young age of 23, shot by one of her own fans, who was embezzling money from her. But the important part is that she was making waves in Mexican-American culture. She was a good singer, she was a great performer, and she became an international icon, more than just a Mexican-American one, popular throughout South America and Central America. She's also known for her lines of fashion, and then for her social activism and the foundation that was made in her honor that continues giving grants to communities and the areas and people in need in the Corpus Christi community. Even today, there are parades held in her honor and people gather at her graveside, even though, if I remember correctly, she was killed in 1998. It's been a while. Another part of the oral culture within Mexican Americans are the dichos y proverbios, sayings and proverbs. One of my favorites that my friend Naomi shared with me was camarón de se duerme y yo lleva la corriente. So the shrimp that falls asleep gets taken away by the current. And an English equivalent might be the early bird gets the worm, but essentially if you're sleeping, you get caught off guard, you don't get to be a part of what's going on. And Casas talked about her grandmother sharing that one with her all the time, and just hearing her mom say different quotes and sayings like gota a gota, la mar se agota. So drop by drop, the sea dries up, which is similar to slow and steady wins the race, or you eat an elephant one bite at a time. Hispanic heritage is an interesting subject. Actually, Hispanic Heritage Month is actually right now. It's between September 15th and October 15th of each year. And one of the reasons it's important is because a lot of Hispanics struggle with their identity, with their ties to both American culture and Mexican culture, or other Hispanic cultures. And so this month allows them to focus back to their roots or to their family's roots. And what's interesting is they all have the markers of being American, yet they are the children of immigrants. So they're treated both as immigrants and as Americans, just depending on the social context. After years of attempting to assimilate into a world I felt both included and excluded from, I've learned to stop categorizing myself into just one label. And that's one Mexican American, one Hispanic that was talking about her family's immigration story and how she's felt growing up, sort of torn between multiple identities. One of the big parts of that Hispanic heritage is the family's immigration story, whether it was the parents or the grandparents that came over from Mexico or from Cuba or from Puerto Rico, sort of building their family and planting them here. That's a big part of the Hispanic heritage. Now, On to the most important part of this presentation. It's discussing the status of evangelization and the church planting strategies for reaching second-generation Mexican Americans based on my research and based on an interview with Everardo Borunda, who is the Hispanic Ministry Partners at Oklahoma Baptists, which is the convention in Oklahoma, the Southern Baptist Convention affiliate within Oklahoma. So first off, in Oklahoma, there are 70 Southern Baptist Hispanic ministry works on record, including missions, not like overseas missions, but missions established by other churches, independently established churches, and then ministries, Hispanic ministries within Anglo churches. None of these are necessarily focused on second-generation immigrants or on second-generation Mexican immigrants in particular either. Because for the second generation, there has never been an intentional effort to reach US-born Hispanics. The emphasis has always been to reach the Spanish speaker, which is their parents. And the Mexican Americans, the second generation, is quickly overtaking the first generation in numbers of population and in just, as you can see in the next quote, that the population is exploding across North America, and that Hispanics right now are more receptive to the gospel than ever before. The circumstances could not be better to see a movement of God. And that is so exciting to me to know that essentially the biggest growing population in the entire country is more receptive to the gospel than ever before. And so we have our work cut out for us, but it's exciting to see. Some of the bridges, oh, I'm sorry, I switched this on my presentation. The left side should actually be the barriers and the right side should be the bridges. But some of the barriers to evangelization are shame. People feel like they can't be forgiven, they don't deserve it, and so they avoid the church. They avoid anything that tells them that they have to change. And a second thing is that they're treated as if they are the first generation. They're like, no, I don't necessarily want a church service in Spanish, or I don't even speak Spanish outside of my house. I don't want a church that's like that. Or maybe they're treated as if they're immigrants, even though they're not. They're American born. Syncretism is another barrier because, as I mentioned earlier, some of these people will have grown up in a Catholic church and then left. Some of them will then join a Protestant church or not be affiliated with any religion. And so they'll take bits and pieces of different religions and sort of mix them to practice what they think is best or what aligns with what they feel is like the truth. The mindset of church planters that all Hispanics are the same is absolutely a huge barrier, because the reality that is that a prevailing collective identity exists in U.S. society that considers all Hispanics as Mexicans. Not all Hispanics are Mexicans. As I mentioned earlier, some are Peruvian, some are Cuban, Puerto Rican, Colombian, Belizean, like any Central American, South American country, even some Brazilians who are Latino but not Hispanic because they speak Portuguese and they're of European descent but not of Spanish descent, so they're Latino. Sometimes they're even considered Hispanics or grouped in with Mexicans, but their culture and their language is very different. Some of the bridges, however, to evangelization are the Catholic Bible, which is interesting. A lot of young men and women aren't really taught to dig into their Bible as they're going through church, going through confirmation classes. They learn the lessons, they do it mainly because their parents want them to, but there are actually quite a few parallels between the Catholic Bible and between the canonical Bible, the Bible that Protestants use. And another barrier is forgiveness. As I said before, many Mexican families don't practice conflict resolution. They don't forgive each other. And so something that Casas talked to me about was that forgiveness is something that drew her to the faith when she saw that she could be forgiven for what she had done in the past, and that God would still love her. Also, the idea of brotherly love, a united body of Christ, a global family of believers or church family, tying back to that family first mentality where people are taking care of each other, people are loving each other. And then this is probably my most favorite bridge, is gente puente, the bridge people. And that's what Mexican Americans really are, because instead of being a liability, their biculturalism and bilingualism becomes a marvelous asset in the furtherance of the kingdom of God across cultural barriers in this country and throughout the world. So they can't just speak to one language, they can speak to two. And they can't just speak to one culture, because they're part of multiple cultures. It gives them so many opportunities, just as you see Paul in the New Testament, as he can speak with Gentiles and he can speak with Jews, and he can speak knowledgeably to both. Last are some steps for churches and missionaries and for believers. So some strategies include, because it can be a barrier to not do this, treat Mexican Americans as both Mexican and American. They're not just Mexican, as their parents may be immigrants from Mexico. They're also American, as they're born in America. It can be frustrating to have people constantly question your identity as an American citizen, or wondering whether or not you speak English just because you look Hispanic. And so you have to treat, we as believers must be willing to treat each person on an individual basis, but really get to understand that they are both Mexican and American. Something that I spoke to Everardo Burunda about would be developing Hispanic leaders in the church. What he says is, they're already there. We just need to find them, and we need to develop them. We need to encourage them in their walks with God, and to say, hey, you can be a leader, and we need you to be a leader in order to reach your generation and the next generation. He says, if we're going to reach Hispanics, we have to invest the time and resources to develop these leaders. Another important church planting strategy is holding bilingual services or multiple services, one with English and one with Spanish. And the reason that this is important is because it allows multiple generations of the family to participate in church together. It means that grandma, who doesn't speak any English, can come to the same service that grandson, who doesn't speak any Spanish, can come to. And you have, even though you have that that generational divide, and that some of the cultural barriers, even between family members, they're all able to attend one church together as a family. And with that family first culture, this is extremely important. Again, more focused as a group-oriented culture than an individual-oriented culture, and more focused on time and on relationship over time and events. So people are more important than projects. They don't care about registration. They don't care about being on time as much as they care about spending time with people. And so we need to be intentional in cultivating genuine friendships and establishing bridges of communication. Some of the prayer needs are that the Lord would raise up Hispanic leaders, as mentioned before, and also the protection and provision for families facing the consequences of deportation. A lot of times it seems unfair, unjust to these families that their head of household would be deported and not have any opportunity to fight that. There's a lot of powerlessness there, and a lot of times they may be losing all income for their family, and there's just not any hope there that they can see. And so the church can step in and show love there and pray for these families that may be suffering the consequences of deportation. And lastly, some action steps. And the first is that we take mindful action. As an honor and shame culture, it's easier perhaps for Mexican Americans to take offense. They're proud of what they've done and what their families have done, whether it's bought a house, graduated college, they're raising their families in what they believe is to be the right way. And so if an eager church planter steps in and says, here are all the things that you're doing wrong, they don't want to hear that. They want to be loved, and they want to have other people be proud of them for what they've done as well. They want to bring more honor to their family. Some things that churches can do practically is start things like an ESL program. The awesome thing about this is that it empowers first generation immigrants through helping them learn English so they have better job opportunities and more just networking capabilities, and are able to integrate more into American society if they choose to do that. But it also provides avenues into bringing the rest of the family to church. Because if you bring the parents there, then the kids will probably come too. And then you have that whole family unit there. Along with that is a really healthy children's ministry. That's key. A bilingual family will probably have younger kids, and a healthy children's ministry is essential. Church will become an extension of your family, and that's really the way it should be at any church. And so that children's ministry being safe and secure, and just a great teaching ground and fun place for the kids is very important. And one more thing is that after school tutoring programs and resources for young people applying to college and job hunting. So this is how you bring in maybe more middle schoolers and high schoolers, giving them the opportunity, because parents are always looking for ways to help their children succeed in life. And so if you create those opportunities for their children, they're also gonna want to know what's going on at that church. How are they taking care of my kids? They come and visit, and you get the whole family unit there. The last thing is that every source that I read regarding church planting for Hispanics is that the fields are white. They're ripe for the harvest. And what we need to do as church planters, as believers, as missionaries, as followers of Christ, is we need to take what we know. We need to be willing and ready to listen. And we need to follow Jesus's actions in making disciples, and especially focusing on the opportunity that we have in reaching second generation Mexican immigrants. Thank you for listening to my presentation.